That's right. It is Halloween, motherfuckers! And I love me some survival horror games. Oh, and this is going to be a two-parter, so sit your asses down. There is a continuing debate as to what the first actual horror game was. Since many older games have been retroactively characterized as having horror elements, it is next to impossible to decide which game was actually first. So let's just start in 1982 on a cheaply built computer named the Sinclair ZX81. Malcolm E. Evans developed a game for the system called 3D Monster Maze. In this game, you can maneuver through corridors with no weapons, trying to escape a fucking T-Rex that is hunting you.
Get what's going on until you can, unless you see him. And every time you step into a junction, that could happen. He could be waiting right there for you. No, that is a bit unfortunate. You don't normally get eaten that quick.
This game was probably the first to have you pitted without any weapons against an ominous creature chasing you around. Not long after that, Haunted House was released on the Atari 2600, which intermixed exploration, puzzle, and horror elements, all three of which we would see become the standard for survival horror games later on. Sega's arcade game, Monster Bash, was also released that year. In this game, you were pitted against classic Universal movie monsters in a Donkey Kong-style map. Once the original Nintendo Entertainment System came out in 1983, horror-based games became more prominent. Most of these were your standard side-scroller that was licensed off of some B-rate horror movie. But in 1986, Castlevania came out. Still lacking in the scare factor, Castlevania was a really good game. The horror-esque atmosphere of the maps, the details of the enemies, and the gameplay all came together to bring this game from being just another silly horror attempt to one of the greatest games ever released on the NES. In 1988, Namco's Splatterhouse was released in arcades. This game was a beat-em-up that ditched the survival aspects for a quick and violent game. There were many games that would later on emulate this model. The most notable of these was Mortal Kombat, which was released in arcades in 1992. While this game is not typically referred to as a horror game, the heavy amounts of gore and violence it contained were without a doubt its major selling point. In 1992, Wolfenstein 3D was released on PC. In it, you were pitted against Nazis in one of the first FPS games ever made. Doom, which came out just a year later, placed you against hordes of hellish creatures. While Wolfenstein was the first, Doom's popularity helped move the FPS genre into mainstream. Doom would eventually see a release on most consoles during the 90s. While all of these games contained horror elements, none of them really had been able to actually scare us. I think the one thing that most of these games were missing was the strong storyline and well fleshed out characters. Sprites are just too much of a limiting factor when it comes to storytelling in a video game. But it should be noted that there are two games that did break this barrier. The first one that was released was towards the end of the NES's life. This game was called Sweet Home, and it was released by Capcom in 1989. This game is generally considered the first true horror game. It had all the basic staples, such as limited ammo, low health, and of course, the really fucking complex puzzles to solve. The game also contained a strong storyline that was somewhat compelling. This game, without a doubt, set the framework for future survival horror games. The other important game was Clock Tower, which was released on the Super Nintendo in 1995. This game is full of terrifying atmosphere as you make your way through an old creepy mansion. This game included stealth mechanics to help you hide from the serial killer Scissor Man, who is constantly chasing you down throughout the game. Back in the early 90s, developers who were wanting to make a horror game were looking for a new platform to create these games on, and they fucking found it with the compact disc. And because of this, in 1993 we saw the first polygon-based horror game, Alone in the Dark, released. While this game is still not that scary, it definitely created the standards for 3D survival horror games. Mechanics like tank controls and pre-rendered backgrounds both made appearances here. But unfortunately, instead of continuing the trend of using 3D polygons to develop games, developers saw full motion videos as the future of gaming. Games like Dracula Unleashed and The Seventh Guest were both pioneers in this genre when they were first released that year. Fmv Games, while giving you that feel of playing a movie, never actually caught on the same way developers were expecting it to. These games were usually very fucking campy, and they had some terrible ass D-grade actors. All these elements just could not pull off the scares effectively. In the mid-90s, Fmv Games did start to get slightly better. Games like Phantasmagoria and Terror Tracks moved past just being campy and have received a cult fan base since their release in 1995. But then again, they tend to just be fun because of how goofy these games can get, and not so much for the quality of them. Point-and-click adventure games started to become very popular among PC gamers in the early to late 90s, and with that, of course, came the horror games. These games use a mix of full-motion video overlaid with sprites and polygons to give the player a game that focuses more on the storyline than the actual gameplay itself. One horror point-and-click game worth mentioning, above all the others, is 1995's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream.
Hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanoangstrom of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1 billionth of the hate I feel for humans at this micro-instant. For you. Hate! Hate!
This game was based on the novel of the same name by Harlan Ellison. This game definitely falls in line with the greats. In it, the human race is all but extinct, thanks to a supercomputer named Am. The computer has such a hate of the human race that he keeps 5 select people alive, just to torture them for all of eternity. The game has a complex and engaging storyline. The voice acting is pretty damn good also, with Ellison voicing the actual computer himself. The game is very atmospheric, disturbing, and truly terrifying. This game, in my opinion, is the first actual scary game. But it sure as fuck wasn't the last. In fact, it was only the fucking beginning. Soon, a whole slew of amazing horror games were about to come out. This was all thanks to a little game that Capcom put out in 1996. But you know what? We'll get to that next week.